5 years before I stood over my sister in that emergency room, the unraveling of my place in this family did not happen in a single explosion. It happened in numbers, in receipts, in quiet comparisons that I told myself were temporary until they became permanent. Madison's freshman year at Stanford cost $68,000 in tuition alone, not including the $18,000 for housing and the $4,000 study abroad deposit my parents wired without blinking. My freshman year at Penn State cost $23,000, and when I asked how we were handling the difference, my father said, "We are investing where the return is clear." Madison received a white BMW 3 Series on her 21st birthday with a red ribbon stretched across the hood, monthly lease $712, insurance paid in full. I inherited our mother's 10-year-old Toyota Camry with 138,000 miles and a transmission that hesitated in cold weather. When Madison announced she was applying to graduate school, my parents hired a private admissions consultant for $5,000 to polish her essays. When I prepared for the medical college admission test, I used secondhand prep books I bought online for $120 and worked 30 hours a week at a coffee shop to pay for the exam fee. None of this was framed as favoritism. It was framed as practicality. Madison has leadership presence, my mother would say at dinner, slicing chicken into neat pieces. You are more intense. Intense became the family shorthand for difficult. Difficult became unstable. And unstable was the word Madison eventually used the night everything detonated. It was a Sunday in late November, 5 years ago, and we were all in my parents' dining room with the long oak table that seated 10 even though there were only 4 of us. Madison had recently ended a relationship and there had been tension around money, around expectations, around who had access to what. I had confronted her privately about something small, a discrepancy in a story she told our parents about why she needed another $10,000 wired immediately. I did not accuse. I asked a question. The next morning my mother called and her voice was shaking, not with fear but with anger. How could you threaten your own sister? She demanded. I was standing in the hospital parking garage at 6:45 in the morning after an overnight shift. I did not threaten her, I said. There was a pause. She said you told her you would expose her and ruin everything if she did not admit she has always been the favorite. I remember leaning against the concrete pillar and staring at the painted number 27 in chipped blue. I never said that, I told her. My father got on the line. Madison is terrified of you, he said flatly. She thinks you are spiraling. Spiraling. That was the word they chose. Within 2 days, they canceled the automatic transfer that had been covering the remaining $12,000 of my final tuition installment. They removed my access to the joint family credit card they insisted I keep for emergencies. They sent me an email, not a call, outlining boundaries moving forward. It included a line that I have never forgotten: we cannot financially support behavior that destabilizes this family. At Thanksgiving that year, there were 4 place settings at their table. I know because a cousin sent me a photo. 4 plates. 4 wine glasses. No empty chair. I calculated my new reality the way I calculate medication dosages now, precisely. $148,000 in federal loans. 6.8% interest. Monthly payment projected at $1,694 once residency ended. Rent on my apartment, $1,300. Utilities, $180. Health insurance gap coverage, $300. I picked up 2 additional shifts per month, which added approximately $900 after taxes. I stopped buying anything that was not essential. I sold the Camry for $3,000 and bought a used Honda Civic for $2,400 in cash. I did not call them. I did not beg. I did not issue a public defense. Because somewhere in those weeks, between signing loan documents and eating dinner alone at a folding table, I realized something uncomfortable. They had been preparing to believe the worst about me for years. Madison's version simply gave them permission. And permission is powerful. She kept her condo downtown, co-signed by my father. She kept the family vacations, the ski trips in Aspen that cost $12,000 per week. I watched from social media until I stopped watching. When our grandfather, Thomas Carter, called me 3 months later, he did not ask what happened. He said, "Character reveals itself under pressure, Emily. Make sure yours does not crack." He mailed me a cashier's check for $12,000 with a note that read, "Loan. 0 interest. Pay it back when you can." He did not defend me publicly. He did not confront my parents at Sunday dinner. But he saw me. And for a while, that had to be enough. By the time I finished residency, I had not spoken to Madison in 4 years. I had not stepped inside my parents' house in 5. The narrative of who I was had solidified in their world, jealous, volatile, unreliable. In mine, I became disciplined, methodical, controlled. I learned to separate emotion from action. I learned that silence can be strategic. And as I scrubbed in that night and prepared to intervene for the sister who once said she was afraid of me, the numbers flickered through my mind the way they always do. 5 years of absence. $148,000 of debt. 0 apologies. And now, 1 operating room. Becoming the version of me they said did not exist was not loud or dramatic, it was systematic, measured in hours worked and habits built, in the quiet discipline of proving something to myself without an audience. After they withdrew their support and sealed their version of events, I stopped trying to correct the narrative and started constructing a different foundation entirely. My days during residency began at 4:30 in the morning with black coffee and a review of patient charts before sunrise, and they often ended well past 8 in the evening with the fluorescent lights of the hospital still humming overhead. I averaged 80 hours a week for 3 years straight, sometimes closer to 90 during peak rotations, and I tracked everything the way some people track calories or steps. Hours slept, 4 to 5 per night. Debt remaining, $148,000 at graduation, reduced to $129,000 after my first year of aggressive payments. Extra shifts taken, 2 per month at $900 net each. I built a spreadsheet that calculated how much interest accrued daily, down to the dollar and cents, because if I could measure it, I could manage it. What I did not measure was how often I replayed the word spiraling in my head and replaced it with focused. In the emergency department, chaos is constant, but chaos is also predictable if you know where to look. I realized early on that my strength was not volume or charisma, it was pattern recognition. I could walk into a room and within 30 seconds assess tone, posture, breathing, the unspoken tension between family members, and anticipate what would happen next. It was a skill born from years of reading a dinner table before a comment turned into a criticism. When you grow up learning to anticipate emotional shifts, you become excellent at reading clinical ones. I learned to lower my voice instead of raising it. I learned that calm is contagious. During my second year, a senior attending pulled me aside after a difficult overnight case and said, "You do not react. You respond." It was the first time anyone had framed my restraint as a strength instead of a flaw. I kept that sentence the way other people keep awards. While Madison continued her life uninterrupted, posting engagement photos in a condo my father helped finance and attending fundraisers with my parents at her side, I was building credibility the old-fashioned way. Board certification required passing scores above the national average, and I scored in the 87th percentile. My performance reviews consistently used the same words: composed, thorough, decisive. No one in that hospital knew I had once been labeled unstable. They knew me as reliable. There is something powerful about entering a room where your history does not follow you. I paid back my grandfather's $12,000 loan in full within 21 months, sending the final check with a note that said, "Paid as promised." He called me that night and said, "I knew you would." He never asked about my parents. He never pressured reconciliation. He simply continued to treat me as if my integrity had never been in question. That steadiness anchored me more than any apology could have. By the time I completed residency and accepted a full-time position as an attending physician, my salary increased to $235,000 annually before taxes. I did not upgrade my apartment immediately. I did not buy a new car. I increased my loan payments to $3,000 per month and calculated that I could be debt-free in just under 4 years if I maintained the pace. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from self-sufficiency, from knowing that no one can withdraw your stability with a single phone call. And yet, for all the financial independence and professional milestones, there was a quiet ache that surfaced on certain nights, especially holidays when the hospital cafeteria served turkey and canned cranberry sauce and I knew somewhere else there was a table set without me. I did not reach out. They did not either. The silence hardened into routine. I told myself that closure is overrated and that forward motion is enough. But forward motion does not erase origin. It simply distances you from it. On the night Madison's name appeared on my intake screen, I was not the 29-year-old resident scrambling to survive. I was a board-certified physician with 5 years of independent practice, a reputation for precision, and a debt balance reduced to $42,000. I had built a life brick by brick, without their approval, without their money, without their validation. The irony was not lost on me as I sanitized my hands and reviewed her chart. The sister who once described me as unpredictable now lay dependent on the predictability of my training. The parents who believed I destabilized the family were standing in a hallway waiting for the steadiness of my decisions. Everything I had constructed in their absence was about to be tested in their presence. And unlike 5 years ago, I was not scrambling to defend myself. I was prepared to act. If there was one person who never fully accepted the version of me my parents chose to believe, it was my grandfather, Thomas Carter, and he never defended me loudly, he defended me quietly, which in many ways mattered more. 3 months after I was cut off, when the silence from my parents had settled into something permanent, he invited me to his house on a Sunday afternoon the way he had when I was a child. His home was a modest 2,000-square-foot brick ranch 30 minutes outside the city, nothing like the polished suburban house my parents were so proud of, but it was steady, paid off, unchanged for 25 years. He poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs and did not ask me to explain myself. He did not say, "What did you do?" He said, "Tell me what you need." That question alone felt radical. I told him the numbers. Tuition remaining, $12,000. Rent, $1,300 per month. Income from part-time shifts, inconsistent. He listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the table, and when I finished, he nodded once. "I have lived long enough to know that truth does not shout," he said. "It stands still and waits." He stood, walked to his desk, and returned with a cashier's check for $12,000. The memo line read loan. He made me sign a simple handwritten agreement promising repayment with 0 interest. Not charity, he clarified. Respect. That distinction mattered to him. It mattered to me. Over the next 2 years, while I was building my career in the hospital and paying down my debt, he would call every other Thursday at 7:15 in the evening. The conversations were rarely about the conflict. He would ask about my cases, about the rhythms of emergency medicine, about what patterns I noticed. "You always did see what others missed," he told me once. It was the same phrase he had used when I was 12 and caught a bookkeeping error in his old check register that had gone unnoticed for months. He had never called me dramatic. He had never called me unstable. When Madison's story became the family's official narrative, he did not attend the Thanksgiving where I was excluded. He told my parents he had a prior commitment. He never told me that directly, but I heard it later from a cousin. That was his way. Not confrontation. Not spectacle. Just refusal to participate in something he believed was wrong. About 18 months after the fallout, his health began to decline. Congestive heart failure, managed carefully but progressively limiting. I visited him after shifts, sometimes still in scrubs, and we would sit in his living room with the muted television flickering in the background. One evening he handed me a large manila envelope. "This is not for now," he said. "This is for when the truth needs structure." Inside were printed copies of text messages Madison had sent him in the weeks before the accusation, messages where she admitted exaggerating details to make sure Mom and Dad finally saw who Emily really is. He had never shown them to my parents. "If I bring this out too early, it becomes a fight," he explained. "And fights make people defensive. Timing matters." He was not protecting Madison. He was protecting the possibility that someday the truth could surface without destroying everyone in the process. I did not open that envelope again for years. I kept it in a locked drawer in my apartment beside my passport and board certification documents. It was not a weapon. It was insurance. When I finished residency and sent him the final check repaying the $12,000, he called me the same night. "Debt-free to me," he said. "Now make sure you are debt-free to yourself." I did not fully understand what he meant at the time. He passed away 2 years later, quietly, at home, at 82 years old. My parents organized a small service. Madison spoke about his integrity. I stood in the back row, unacknowledged but present. After the service, my father approached me for the first time in 3 years. "He always believed in you," he said, almost defensively. I nodded. He did. That was the only exchange we had. They did not invite me to lunch afterward. I did not expect them to. What I carried with me instead was the memory of my grandfather's steadiness and the envelope he had entrusted to me. He had seen the full picture when others accepted a convenient version. He had not rushed to correct it publicly, but he had prepared for a moment when preparation would matter more than volume. Standing in that emergency department years later, as monitors hummed and nurses moved efficiently around us, I felt his presence not as comfort but as clarity. Character does not announce itself. It reveals itself under pressure. He had told me that when I was 29 and newly disowned. Now at 34, facing the sister who once feared me and the parents who once rejected me, I understood what he meant. He had not saved me from being cut off. He had not forced reconciliation. He had done something quieter and more strategic. He had made sure that when the truth surfaced, it would have documentation, timing, and restraint. And in that hospital corridor, with my parents watching my every move, I realized that the preparation he began years earlier was no longer theoretical. It was about to intersect with the present. The night I was officially erased from my family did not happen in private. It happened under warm dining room lights with polished silverware and a turkey cooling in the center of the table, and I can still replay every second of it with the clarity of a medical chart. It was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, 5 years ago, and my parents had insisted we all come over early to clear the air. Madison sat to my mother's right, wrapped in a cream sweater that cost more than my monthly grocery budget at the time, her eyes already rimmed red like she had prepared for the performance. My father stood at the head of the table instead of sitting down, which should have been my first indication that this was not a conversation but a declaration. We cannot continue like this, he began, hands pressed flat against the oak surface. I remember counting the place settings, 4 white plates evenly spaced, 4 wine glasses filled halfway. Mine included. At least at the start. Madison spoke next, voice trembling in a way that would have convinced anyone who did not know her well. She repeated the accusation, that I had threatened to expose her, that I resented her success, that I had said she did not deserve what she had been given. I interrupted once, calmly, and asked her to look at me and repeat the exact words she claimed I used. She avoided my eyes and looked at our mother instead. My mother did not ask for clarification. She reached for Madison's hand. My father's jaw tightened. This is exactly the manipulation we are talking about, he said, pointing at me as if my request for specifics proved something sinister. I could feel the air shift, the way it does before a storm you know is coming but cannot stop. Until you admit what you did and apologize, my father continued, you are not welcome in this house. The sentence landed with a finality that surprised even me. I asked one question. Admit what, specifically? He did not answer. He pushed his chair back, walked to the kitchen counter, and physically removed my plate from the table. The sound of ceramic sliding across wood is sharper than you think. He carried it to the sink and set it down without looking at me. My mother stared at her napkin. Madison began to cry harder. No one stood. No one objected. I felt something inside me go very still. So this is permanent? I asked, because clarity matters to me. Until you take responsibility, my father replied. Responsibility for something that had not happened. I stood up, folded my napkin, and placed it where my plate had been. I will not confess to something I did not do, I said. My voice did not shake. That seemed to irritate him more than if I had yelled. Then you are choosing this, he responded. That was the moment the narrative flipped. My refusal to lie became proof of guilt. I walked to the hallway, collected my coat, and paused only once at the front door. I thought someone might follow me. No one did. The next day, my access to the family phone plan was terminated. 2 days later, the automatic tuition payment was canceled. By Sunday, I was removed from the family group message thread that had existed for over a decade. Extended relatives began sending cautious texts asking if I was getting help. Madison posted a photo from Thanksgiving with the caption, "Grateful for peace." There were 4 place settings visible in the background. I studied that photo longer than I should have. It was not the loss of money that cut the deepest. It was the efficiency of the erasure. Within 72 hours, it was as if I had opted out voluntarily. When our grandfather declined to attend that dinner, my father told others he was feeling unwell. No one publicly questioned the story. Silence is powerful when maintained by multiple people at once. That night became the reference point for everything that followed. Any attempt I made to reach out was filtered through the assumption that I was unstable. Any boundary I set was labeled defensiveness. So I stopped reaching out. I documented the canceled payments. I saved the emails outlining new family policies. I archived the final message from my mother that read, "We love you, but we cannot support this behavior." Love, apparently, had conditions measured in compliance. 5 years later, standing in a hospital corridor while the same parents watched me review their other daughter's chart, I remembered that plate sliding across the table. I remembered how easily space can be cleared when someone decides you no longer belong. And I understood something I did not grasp back then. They believed removing me would restore stability. They believed distance would fix discomfort. What they did not anticipate was that the person they removed would continue growing without them, building a life so solid that one day they would be forced to stand in it. That dinner was meant to reduce me to a cautionary tale. Instead, it became the starting line of everything I am now. The envelope my grandfather gave me did not feel heavy in my hands the first time, but over the years it gained weight, not physically, but symbolically, because it contained something I never wanted to need and yet always knew might matter. I kept it in the back of my locked desk drawer beside my passport and state medical license, sealed with a simple clasp, unremarkable, almost forgettable if you did not know what was inside. I did not open it the night he handed it to me. I trusted him. If he said timing mattered, then timing mattered. It was not until a year after his funeral, on a quiet Sunday afternoon when rain tapped steadily against my apartment windows, that I finally sat at my kitchen table and unfolded the documents inside. There were printed text message screenshots between Madison and my grandfather dated 3 weeks before the Thanksgiving dinner that ended everything. In them, she admitted she had exaggerated our conversation because she felt I had judged her, and she needed our parents to see that I had always been jealous. One message stood out in particular. I might have leaned into it so they would finally stop comparing us. The timestamp was clear. The wording was clear. There was no ambiguity. She had not described fear. She had described strategy. My grandfather had also included a brief notarized statement signed 6 months before his death affirming that he had witnessed Madison's admission and that he believed the accusation against me had been knowingly distorted. The statement ended with a single sentence in his handwriting: "Truth does not rush, but it does arrive." I remember staring at that line for a long time. I could have sent those documents to my parents immediately. I could have forwarded the screenshots to every relative who quietly questioned my stability. I could have forced a confrontation. That would have cornered Madison publicly. But I did nothing. Not because I was afraid. Because I was deliberate. The documents were not revenge. They were leverage. And leverage only works when used at the right moment. I slid everything back into the envelope and returned it to the drawer. I told myself that if I ever needed to correct the narrative formally, I would have proof that did not rely on emotion or memory. Over the next 3 years, that envelope remained untouched while I built my career and repaid debt and rebuilt myself without them. It became less about exposing Madison and more about protecting my integrity if the accusation resurfaced in a way that threatened my professional standing. In medicine, allegations can follow you. Character references matter. The idea that someone might describe me as unstable in a professional context was not theoretical. It was dangerous. The envelope ensured that if the lie ever crossed into my workplace, it would not be defenseless. I had documentation. I had timestamps. I had a notarized statement. I had 72 hours, according to my grandfather's handwritten note attached to the back, to respond decisively if the narrative was weaponized again. He had written, "If they attempt to formalize the accusation in a way that harms you professionally, you have 72 hours to present this evidence before it solidifies." That was the only condition he outlined. Not to embarrass. Not to punish. Only to protect. Standing in the emergency department now, 5 years after the dinner that ended my place at their table, I could feel the weight of that envelope even though it was miles away in my apartment drawer. Madison's condition required immediate intervention, and I focused on clinical details first, because that is what training demands. But beneath the surface, another calculation was forming. If this night led to public discussion, if my involvement became known beyond these walls, if old narratives resurfaced, I would not stand unarmed. My grandfather had prepared for this possibility long before I understood it fully. He had not confronted my parents because he knew confrontation without readiness only deepens denial. He had waited. He had documented. He had anticipated that one day the truth might intersect with a moment too significant to ignore. And here we were. My parents standing 10 feet away from me in a hospital corridor, their daughter dependent on my competence, their previous certainty quietly dissolving in real time. The envelope was not about destroying Madison. It was about ensuring that when the story shifted, it would shift permanently. Timing, he had said, matters. And as the clock above the nurse's station ticked toward 3 in the morning, I understood that timing was no longer abstract. The moment he prepared me for was unfolding, not in a courtroom or at a holiday dinner, but under fluorescent lights where skill outweighs accusation. The documents existed. The truth existed. And for the first time since I was told to leave that table, I felt something steady inside me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with readiness. There is a moment in every crisis when the external urgency collides with the internal one, and for me that moment arrived as I stood at the scrub sink, water running over my hands, knowing that what I was about to do would define more than a medical outcome. The clinical decision was straightforward. Madison's condition required immediate intervention, and I was the most qualified attending on shift. The ethical decision, however, was layered. Could I step aside? Yes. Hospital policy allowed for reassignment if a physician felt a personal conflict. Would that delay care? Possibly by 20 to 30 minutes while another surgeon was called in from home. Would that delay increase risk? In situations like this, minutes matter. I stared at my reflection in the small stainless steel panel above the sink and asked myself a question that had nothing to do with medicine. If I walk away, who am I protecting? My pride? My anger? Or my integrity? 5 years ago, my refusal to admit to something I did not do cost me my family. Tonight, my refusal to act could cost something far greater. I thought about the envelope in my drawer. I thought about my grandfather's handwriting. I thought about the dinner table where my plate had been removed. And I understood something with unsettling clarity. Saving her would not erase what happened. But refusing to save her would redefine me in a way I could never undo. My parents stood at the edge of the corridor, whispering to each other, their voices tight, their certainty fractured. For years they believed I was volatile, unpredictable, dangerous to the family's stability. If I stepped back now, they would have a new story to tell. Emily could not handle it. Emily made it about herself. Emily proved us right. The irony would write itself. I dried my hands slowly and felt the weight of choice settle into something solid. This was not about reconciliation. It was not about proving them wrong in the heat of the moment. It was about deciding who I would be when no one could question my authority. I walked back toward the operating room doors and gave clear instructions to the team. My voice was steady. My posture was measured. Inside, the emotional current was undeniable, but it did not control my actions. That was the difference between who they thought I was and who I had become. As the anesthesiologist confirmed readiness and the nurses completed their final checks, my father approached cautiously. "Emily," he said again, softer this time, "we did not know it was this serious." I met his eyes without flinching. "It is serious," I replied. "But it is manageable." Manageable. A word that applied to more than the procedure. I felt the past pressing in, tempting me to demand an apology before lifting a single instrument, tempting me to expose the lie right there in the hallway, to retrieve the envelope from my bag and end the narrative permanently. I did not. Timing matters. This was not the moment for documentation. This was the moment for discipline. If I acted out of resentment, even subtly, I would carry that decision long after tonight ended. And I have learned that the hardest consequences are the ones you impose on yourself. I stepped through the double doors, the sound sealing off the hallway behind me. For the next several hours, there would be no room for history. Only training. Only focus. Only the deliberate sequence of actions I have practiced for years. There is a misconception that strength is loud, that justice requires confrontation in the exact moment of injury. But sometimes strength is the quiet refusal to let someone else's mistake dictate your character. As I positioned myself and prepared to begin, I made a decision that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with identity. I would act according to my standards, not theirs. I would perform with the precision I demand of myself, not the doubt they once projected onto me. And whatever happened after tonight, whatever conversations unfolded in recovery rooms or quiet hallways, I would know that when given the choice between retaliation and responsibility, I chose responsibility. The lie that separated us had defined 5 years of my life. This decision would define who I was beyond it. And in that operating room, under bright lights and steady monitors, I understood that integrity is not proven when you are treated fairly. It is proven when you are not, and you still choose to act with excellence. The operating room is never a place for ego, and that night it was especially not a place for isolation, because no matter how personal the history was outside those doors, inside I was not a daughter or a sister, I was the attending physician leading a team that trusted me completely. Sarah, our charge nurse with 12 years of trauma experience, stood to my left reviewing vitals in real time, her voice calm and precise as she called out updates. Dr. Patel, the anesthesiologist, monitored every fluctuation with the steady focus of someone who has seen thousands of cases and still treats each one as singular. 2 residents assisted, both in their late 20s, both looking at me for cues not just in technique but in tone. Leadership in medicine is not about volume. It is about clarity. We move step by step, I said, outlining the sequence before we began, ensuring everyone understood their role. I have learned that preparation reduces panic, and panic is the real enemy in any critical situation. Outside the operating room doors, my parents were likely replaying their own version of the past 5 years. Inside, none of that mattered. What mattered was coordination. What mattered was communication. What mattered was the trust this team had built with me over hundreds of hours working side by side. When you spend years proving your competence to colleagues who owe you nothing, you create alliances rooted in performance, not family loyalty. Sarah caught my eye at one point and gave the smallest nod, a gesture that said without words, "We have this." She knew my last name. Everyone on staff did. She had glanced at the intake form earlier and paused for a fraction of a second before saying quietly, "You want me to call in backup?" It was not doubt. It was support. I shook my head. We are good. That is what building credibility buys you. Options. Respect. Backup when needed, and space when not. I did not fight this battle alone because I was never meant to. Medicine is a coalition by design. Every instruction I gave was met with immediate response. Every adjustment was anticipated. The monitors stabilized incrementally, numbers moving towards safety instead of away from it. In moments like this, competence becomes communal. It is not about one person performing heroics. It is about a coordinated system functioning at its highest level. I thought briefly about how different this was from the family dynamic I grew up in, where narratives were formed without evidence and decisions were made without collaboration. Here, evidence dictated action. Data shaped conclusions. Assumptions were challenged in real time. Pressure holding steady, Dr. Patel announced. Oxygen levels stable. Those words carried weight far beyond their clinical meaning. Stability. The very thing my parents once claimed I disrupted. The procedure lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes. Long enough for fatigue to attempt entry, but not long enough to compromise focus. At one point, a junior resident hesitated, hands uncertain, and I guided calmly, explaining the rationale behind each step so he understood not just what to do but why. Teaching in the middle of intensity is an act of confidence. It signals that you are not overwhelmed. By the time we completed the final checks and confirmed the immediate crisis had passed, the room exhaled collectively. Not dramatically. Just subtly. Controlled relief. I removed my gloves, washed my hands again, and looked around at the team that had stood with me. Good work, I said. It was simple, but it mattered. They responded not with praise for me, but with professional acknowledgement. That is the culture I had helped cultivate. Outside those doors, history waited. Inside, collaboration had just rewritten the trajectory of a life. As we prepared to transfer Madison to recovery, Sarah leaned in slightly and said, "You handled that exactly right." She did not specify what she meant. The technical execution? The emotional restraint? Both, perhaps. I nodded once. There was no need for elaboration. The alliance in that room was not built on blood or obligation. It was built on demonstrated ability and mutual respect. And as I walked toward the hallway where my parents stood waiting for answers, I carried with me not just the outcome of a procedure, but the quiet reinforcement that I did not stand alone in my competence. Whatever conversation came next, whatever truths surfaced or defenses crumbled, I would enter it supported by the reality of what had just occurred. Not a narrative. Not an accusation. A measurable, undeniable result achieved through preparation, partnership, and control. When I stepped through the double doors and removed my surgical cap, the hallway felt smaller than before, as if the weight of 5 years had condensed into the narrow space between the recovery unit and the waiting area. My parents stood up immediately when they saw me. My mother's hands were clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had gone pale. My father looked older than he had 3 hours earlier, shoulders slightly rounded, certainty replaced by something closer to apprehension. I stopped a few feet away from them, maintaining the same professional distance I use with every family member awaiting news. She is stable, I said first, because clarity should never be delayed. The immediate danger has been addressed. She will remain under close observation for the next 24 hours. My mother exhaled in a way that sounded almost like a sob, but restrained. My father swallowed and nodded once. "Thank you," he said, and the words seemed unfamiliar in his mouth when directed at me. For a moment, no one spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Nurses passed behind me with charts and quiet conversations, the hospital continuing its steady rhythm around us. I could see them searching my face for something more than a clinical update. An invitation, perhaps. An opening. My father finally stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Emily, we did not know who was on call tonight." I held his gaze evenly. "I was scheduled 12 hours in advance," I replied. It was not an accusation. It was a fact. Facts have a way of landing harder than anger. My mother's eyes filled, but she did not look away this time. "You saved her," she whispered. I corrected her gently. "The team saved her. Medicine is not a solo effort." That distinction mattered. I would not allow this to become a narrative of heroic redemption that erased the complexity of what brought us here. Madison was transferred to recovery within the hour. I reviewed her chart one more time before stepping into the observation room. The monitors reflected steady improvement. Her breathing was regulated. Her blood pressure was holding without additional support. I stood at the foot of the bed and observed her the way I would observe any patient, detached yet attentive. For a brief second, the image of her sitting at that Thanksgiving table surfaced in my mind, confident in a story that had cost me everything. I let the memory pass. It had no place here. Outside the room, my parents waited again, but differently now. Not as judges. As dependents. When Madison regained consciousness briefly, groggy but responsive, I was there. She looked at me with confusion first, then recognition, then something I had not seen before. Fear, yes. But not of me. Fear of what she might have lost. Emily, she said faintly. I stepped closer, careful to keep my tone measured. You are in recovery. The procedure went well. You need to rest. She blinked slowly, processing. My parents hovered at the edge of the doorway, unsure whether to enter fully. Madison's eyes shifted toward them, then back to me. There was a long pause where no one spoke, and in that silence something unspoken rearranged itself. For 5 years, I had existed in their world as a cautionary absence. Now I stood in front of them as an undeniable presence. Not emotional. Not explosive. Effective. When Madison drifted back into sleep, I stepped out into the hallway again. My father cleared his throat. We owe you, he began. I raised a hand slightly, not dismissive, but firm. You do not owe me, I said. I did my job. The sentence held more layers than he realized. I did my job tonight. I did my job 5 years ago when I refused to confess to something untrue. I did my job every day in between, building a life without them. My mother looked at me with something closer to humility than I had ever seen. We were wrong about you, she said quietly. It was not a full apology. It was not detailed. But it was the first crack in a wall that had stood for half a decade. I did not respond immediately. I let the words settle. This was not the moment to retrieve the envelope or recite timestamps. This was the moment to allow reality to speak for itself. Madison will need follow-up care and monitoring, I continued, returning to practical matters. I will assign another attending for the remainder of her stay to avoid any appearance of conflict. She will receive the same standard of care as any other patient. Professional boundaries restored order to the space. As I turned to leave, my father said my name again, softer this time. Emily. I paused but did not step closer. We would like to talk, he said. I nodded once. Not tonight. And for the first time in years, that boundary did not feel like defiance. It felt like strength. By the time I left the hospital that morning, the sky was turning pale blue over the parking structure, and exhaustion settled into my shoulders not from the procedure itself but from the emotional recalibration that had taken place in a single night. I did not go home immediately. I sat in my car with the engine off and let the silence stretch, replaying the hallway conversation, my mother's voice when she said they were wrong about me, my father's careful tone when he asked to talk. 5 years ago, I would have taken that request as validation, as the beginning of reconciliation I had secretly hoped for. Now, I evaluated it the way I evaluate any decision. What is the cost? What is the outcome? What is the timing? Later that afternoon, after sleeping for 3 hours and reviewing Madison's updated chart remotely to confirm her vitals remained stable, I received a text from my father. It was the first direct message from him in 5 years. We are in the family waiting lounge. If you are willing, we would like to speak before we head home. The wording was formal, almost corporate, as if he were requesting a meeting rather than addressing his daughter. I drove back to the hospital, not because I owed them immediate access, but because clarity delayed can become distortion. They were seated side by side when I entered the lounge, my mother holding a paper cup of untouched coffee, my father staring at the floor as if organizing his thoughts. I remained standing. Physical positioning matters. We need to address what happened 5 years ago, my father began. There was no defensiveness in his tone this time, only caution. Madison has told us more this morning. That sentence alone signaled a shift. Madison had spoken. My mother looked at me directly. She admitted she exaggerated the situation. She said she felt compared to you and reacted. Reacted. A softer word than lied, but closer to truth than anything I had heard before. I did not interrupt. I allowed them to continue. We should have asked you for specifics, my father said slowly. We did not. It was not eloquent. It was not emotional. But it was the first acknowledgement of process failure rather than character judgment. I nodded once. You made a decision without evidence, I replied. And you acted on it immediately. There was no accusation in my tone. Only sequence. My mother's eyes filled again. We thought we were protecting her, she said. At my expense, I answered calmly. Silence settled between us. Not hostile. Just heavy. My father cleared his throat. If there is documentation, if there is something we should see, the invitation was subtle but unmistakable. The envelope in my desk drawer flashed in my mind. The notarized statement. The timestamps. The 72-hour clause. I had prepared for a moment when the accusation might threaten my career. This was not that moment. This was a moment of emerging recognition. There is documentation, I said evenly. I kept it in case the narrative affected my professional standing. My father's head lifted slightly, surprise crossing his face. You documented it? He asked. Yes, I replied. Because allegations can follow physicians. The implication was clear. Their belief had risked more than family tension. It had risked my livelihood. My mother placed her coffee down with trembling fingers. We never considered that, she whispered. I believed her. They had been focused on internal dynamics, not external consequences. Madison would like to speak with you when she is stronger, my father continued. She says she owes you an apology. I considered that carefully. An apology is not closure. It is a beginning. I am open to hearing her, I said. But understanding will require more than a single conversation. My father nodded slowly. We understand. That phrase carried more humility than I had heard from him in years. I reached into my bag and removed a folded piece of paper, not the envelope itself, but a photocopy of my grandfather's notarized statement. I placed it on the table between us. This was prepared before he passed, I said. He anticipated this. Conversation might eventually happen. My father's hands hesitated before picking it up. My mother leaned in as he read. Their expressions shifted from confusion to recognition to quiet shame. When he finished, he exhaled slowly. He knew, he said. Yes, I answered. He did. There was no triumph in the moment. Only confirmation. The truth had structure now. Not accusation. Documentation. My mother reached across the small table but stopped short of touching my hand. We cannot undo what we did, she said softly. No, I agreed. You cannot. And yet, something had already been undone. The certainty that I was unstable. The narrative that I was the problem. It had fractured under evidence and competence combined. As I stood to leave, my father spoke once more. Emily, if you are willing, we would like to begin again. Begin again. Not resume. Not pretend. Begin. I paused at the doorway. Beginning requires accountability, I said. Not just acknowledgement. He nodded. We are ready. For the first time in 5 years, I did not feel erased in their presence. I felt evaluated, recognized, and cautiously respected. That was not forgiveness. But it was a shift. And shifts, when documented and deliberate, change trajectories. Madison asked to see me alone 2 days later, after her condition had stabilized and the monitors around her bed displayed steady numbers instead of urgent ones, and when I stepped into her room that afternoon the sunlight through the blinds cut soft lines across the floor, nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just ordinary light illuminating an extraordinary shift in power. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically fragile, but stripped of the certainty she used to carry like armor. My parents waited outside at her request. This conversation, she said, needed to happen without an audience. I pulled a chair to the side of her bed and sat down, maintaining the same measured posture I use with every patient. For a moment neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with 5 years of silence. She broke it first. I lied, she said. No qualifiers. No framing. Just 2 words. I did not react immediately. I let the statement settle, the way you let lab results settle before interpreting them. Why? I asked, not because I did not know, but because I needed to hear her articulate it. She swallowed and looked down at her hands. I felt compared to you all the time, she admitted. You were the disciplined one. The focused one. When I made mistakes, I thought Mom and Dad would finally see that you were not as perfect as they thought. The irony did not escape either of us. They had never thought I was perfect. They had thought I was unstable. But in her mind, the competition had been real. So you exaggerated, I said evenly. She shook her head slowly. I constructed it, she corrected. I framed the conversation in a way that made it sound threatening. Constructed. Framed. Words that belong in a courtroom, not a family dining room. I reached into my bag and removed the full envelope this time, not just a photocopy, and placed it on the tray table beside her bed. Grandpa anticipated this, I said. Her eyes widened slightly. He knew, she asked. He had evidence, I replied. I opened the envelope and laid out the printed messages in chronological order, the timestamps visible, the notarized statement attached. I did not raise my voice. I did not dramatize. I let the paper speak. She read them slowly, her breathing uneven but steady. When she reached the line where she had written, I might have leaned into it so they would finally stop comparing us, her shoulders dropped. I forgot I said that, she whispered. I did not, I answered. There was no satisfaction in exposing it. Only closure. For 5 years, I had carried the knowledge that the truth existed on paper. Now it existed in front of both of us. Do you understand what that cost me? I asked quietly. She nodded, tears forming but not spilling. You lost tuition. You lost them. You lost holidays. I lost reputation, I added. Allegations follow people in my field. If that narrative had crossed into my hospital, it could have ended my career. She looked up sharply. I never thought about that. That was the problem, I said. No one thought beyond the dinner table. Silence stretched again, but this time it was reflective rather than defensive. Why did you still help me? She asked finally. The question hung between us, raw and unfiltered. I considered it carefully before answering. Because my character is not contingent on yours, I said. And I refuse to let someone else's mistake dictate who I become. She closed Her eyes briefly, absorbing that. I do not expect forgiveness, she said. But I want to repair what I broke. Repair. Another structural word. Repair requires truth publicly, not just privately, I replied. The same clarity that removed me needs to restore accuracy. She nodded without hesitation. I will tell them. All of it. No soft language. That was the first moment I believed change might be possible. Not because she was apologizing, but because she was willing to correct the record with the same specificity that had once condemned me. I gathered the documents and slid them back into the envelope. Timing matters, I said, echoing my grandfather's voice without mentioning him again. This does not need to be explosive. It needs to be precise. She managed a faint, exhausted smile. You always were precise, she said. 5 years ago, that trait had been weaponized against me. Today, it was acknowledged. As I stood to leave, she reached out slightly but stopped short of touching my hand, mirroring the gesture our mother had made in the waiting lounge. Emily, she said softly, I am sorry. The words were simple, unembellished. I met her eyes. I know, I replied. Not I forgive you. Not yet. But I know. And sometimes recognition is the first structural beam in rebuilding something that was dismantled. 3 weeks after Madison was discharged, we sat around the same oak dining table where my plate had once been removed, and for the first time in 5 years there were 4 place settings again, evenly spaced, no gaps, no symbolic absences. The house looked the same, the framed family photos still lining the hallway, the polished wood floors reflecting the soft yellow light overhead, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that could not be staged. My father had asked for this dinner specifically to address what happened, not quietly, not in fragments, but completely. Madison spoke first. She did not cry this time. She did not soften her language. She explained that she had distorted our conversation because she felt insecure, because she feared comparison, because she believed aligning my parents against me would protect her position. She acknowledged that no one had demanded proof from her and that I had been removed without evidence. My mother listened with her hands folded in front of her, not interrupting, not defending. My father asked for clarification. On dates, on wording, on sequence, as if he were reconstructing a case he once closed too quickly. When Madison finished, the room was silent. I did not speak immediately. I let the air hold the weight of truth without rushing to fill it. 5 years ago, I had asked for specifics and was told my request itself was manipulation. Tonight, specifics were the foundation of accountability. My father turned to me. We failed you, he said plainly. Not we misunderstood. Not we were confused. Failed. It was the first time he used language that acknowledged action rather than perception. My mother's voice was softer but steady. We chose the version that was easier for us to believe. That sentence landed deeper than an apology. Easier. It had been easier to see me as unstable than to question the child who appeared more socially confident. Easier to remove me than to investigate. Easier to protect comfort than to pursue accuracy. I rested my hands on the table and looked at each of them in turn. I cannot undo what happened, I said. Neither can you. But if we are rebuilding, it has to be built on process, not assumption. My father nodded slowly. What does that look like? He asked. I answered without hesitation because I had thought about this for years. It looks like evidence before judgment. It looks like direct conversations before conclusions. It looks like boundaries that are respected even when inconvenient. Madison agreed immediately. My mother reached across the table and this time did not stop short. Her hand rested lightly over mine. I allowed it. Not because everything was resolved, but because the gesture felt earned rather than forced. The envelope remained in my bag that night. I did not need to open it again. Its purpose had been fulfilled. The truth had surfaced not through explosion but through alignment of evidence and experience. Over the following months, change came in measured increments. My parents reinstated my name on family communications, not as a symbolic gesture but with consistent inclusion. They visited my hospital once, not to observe my authority, but to understand my world. My father asked detailed questions about my practice, about patient flow, about decision-making protocols. For the first time, his curiosity felt respectful rather than evaluative. Madison and I met separately for coffee one Saturday afternoon. We did not attempt to compress 5 years of silence into one conversation. We spoke about practical things first. Work schedules. Financial independence. Therapy, which she had begun voluntarily. Repair, I learned, is less dramatic than rupture. It is repetitive. It is intentional. It is sometimes uncomfortable. But it is possible. I did not return to being the daughter who sought validation at every turn. That version of me no longer existed. Instead, I remained who I had become during the absence, disciplined, measured, self-sufficient. The difference was that now my presence was not questioned. It was recognized. On the 5th anniversary of the dinner that removed me, my father called and said, "We are grateful you did not let our mistake redefine you." I paused before responding. It did redefine me, I said honestly. It forced me to build differently. There was no bitterness in the statement. Only truth. Looking back, the night in the emergency department was not about dramatic reversal. It was about moral consistency. I did not save Madison to earn redemption. I saved her because that is who I am. I did not present documentation to win. I presented it to clarify. And I did not agree to rebuild because I needed them. I agreed because rebuilding on honest ground is stronger than pretending nothing broke. 5 years ago, a plate was removed from a table and I walked out alone. 5 years later, I walked back in not as someone seeking reinstatement, but as someone who had already proven her worth without it. That is the difference between being erased and being established. And that difference is permanent. When a daughter is cut off by her parents over her sister's lie, everything she built is forced to stand on its own. 5 years later, the same daughter becomes the only hope in an emergency room where skill, integrity, and truth collide, and what unfolds is one of those unforgettable family stories that prove character outlasts accusation. In this powerful narrative, the daughter does not fight with volume but with discipline, rising through long shifts, overwhelming debt, and silent judgment to become a respected physician, while the sister must confront the consequences of a lie that once reshaped their entire household. This is not just drama. It is one of those family stories where emotional justice is earned, not handed out. As evidence surfaces and accountability replaces assumption, the parents are forced to reevaluate the story they chose because it was easier. In the world of family stories, truth may move slowly, but it arrives with structure and proof. Lesson 1: Integrity is proven under pressure, not praise. When treated unfairly, your response defines you more than the accusation ever could. Magnifying glass tilted right. Lesson 2: Evidence matters more than emotion. Assumptions destroy trust, but documented truth rebuilds it with clarity. Shield. Lesson 3: Boundaries are not revenge. They are the architecture of self-respect. Through measured decisions and moral consistency, the daughter shows that rebuilding does not require forgetting. It requires accountability, courage, and timing. Among today's most compelling family stories, this one stands out because it is not about dramatic retaliation, but about choosing excellence when bitterness would have been easier. And in the landscape of modern family stories, that kind of strength is what makes someone truly unstoppable.